Hello, everybody. Thank you to have joined this webinar. It's a special week. We are celebrating 20 years of shelter cluster coordination. This webinar, check. It's the second from 5 webinars you will have the chance to follow this week at the same time at 12 o'clock Central Europe time. This webinar, so it will be on shaping shelter, the role of standard and policy, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We will share with you further details concerning this webinar. I just would like to start with some housekeeping. So this webinar, we have interprets, direct interpretation, so translation in Spanish and in French. So as you can see, it's very important to select your language, then you will be able to understand this webinar. So you can see below on the icon interpretation. So if you click on that, you will be able to select French, Spanish, or English. It's also important to select the English language because we will have someone speaking French, so you will be able to also understand the translation in English. If you don't see the interpretation icon, you can see on the right, you will see the more icon that you can also select the language. So this meeting is recorded because we will publish on the shelter cluster website. Select your language. Please add the chat to add your question, reflection, comments, or any resource or links you would like to share. We will have some time we have 5 minutes after the presentation to answer the question, but we'll just be able to have 1 question per panelist. Please raise your hand when you would like to speak, because we will need to give you the access to the mic and to the video. We thank you in advance to turn on your camera when you speak and turn off your microphone when muted. We thank you also to be mindful of time and keep your contribution concise because we have a lot to discuss. Just a small reminder about this Shelter Week, 20 years anniversary of the Global Shelter Cluster. So from Monday to Friday, we will have 5 webinars. Most of them are 90 minutes, and only the last one on Friday, Shaping the New Humanitarian Cluster, will be for 2 hours. So you can also register from the post you have you read on LinkedIn on the global update. The main objective of the 5 webinars is to celebrate 2 decades of humanitarian shelter coordination, to reflect on lessons learned and involving practice, co-create the next chapter of coordination. As you know, the shelter cluster has merged with HLP and SITE, and now the new name is Shelter Site and Shelter Land and Site Coordination Cluster, SLCC. So it's not anymore the GSC, is the SLCC, which will be launched very soon. I'm passing now over to Mandy to share further details for this webinar. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mandy.
Thank you so much, Pascal, and welcome to everybody. My name is Mandy George, and I'm part of the Global Shelter Clusters support team. I work as an environmental advisor, so we're here to talk about a topic more broad than environment today. So welcome to our day 2 of the series marking 20 years of shelter cluster coordination and 2 decades of collective work, which is a long time and probably is making some of us feel a little bit vintage, but also means we have a lot of learning and reflection to share. I hope that many of you were able to join the webinar yesterday, which chronicled a bit the history of the cluster, and it was a very fitting and moving as well start to this week of reflection and celebration. So today we are talking about standards and policies, which may not sound exactly like the most sexy of terms, But actually, I think these are some of the quiet heroes of our work. They are the reason that our responses talk the same language across the world, and they help the chaos from becoming even more chaotic in many cases. And in terms of shelter cluster coordination, specifically, policies and standards have been one of our most defining contributions. So whether it's post-tsunami times or looking at some of today's climate-driven and protracted crises, agreeing on shared approaches has consistently shaped the quality, safety, and dignity of shelter responses worldwide. They are the backbone of predictable, principled, and accountable action that help country clusters translate global good practice into local reality, support agencies to work coherently, and really importantly, give affected communities a clear sense of what they can expect. And we'll hear later in this webinar some examples of all of these really important things. So today specifically, we want to reflect on how these standards and policies have evolved, how they continue to change, and how relevant they remain in a humanitarian landscape that looks very different from 20 years ago. So some of the big questions that we will explore today, both through presentations that we're going to hear and also a Menti discussion at the end of the webinar, are around whether universal standards are still relevant in a world moving towards localization. How do we make sure they support rather than constrain local actors? How do we strike a balance between local ownership and global coherence? What are the roles of clusters in the changing humanitarian landscape? And finally, what lessons can we draw from these examples for future policy or standard development? So we have a great lineup to help us. If you could go to the next slide, please. We have a great lineup to help us unpack all of this today with perspectives from the global, the thematic, and the country levels. So first, we're going to hear from Ella, who's going to reflect on the evolution of Sphere and the role of universal standards. Then Kelly is going to explore for us 20 years of environmental progress and the gap that still exists between policy and practice. And finally, we'll hear from Ephraim from Burkina Faso and Patrick from Syria, who will show us how technical guidance at the country level can directly shape safer, more dignified outcomes. After the presentations, and we'll have a bit of Q&A integrated there, we'll jump over to the Mentimeter and explore these issues together. So please stay with us and bring all of your ideas to the conversation. At any point, you can put questions into the chat, and you can also raise your hand and you'll be given permission to speak. It'd be really nice to hear from you directly as we have this conversation. So yes, we will have a bit of dedicated time for questions after the first two speakers, and then again after the second two. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand over to Ella. Ella is the Urban Resilience and Settlements Lead at IFRC. But I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that she was Global Cluster Coordinator at IFRC for over 7 years. So she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this conversation, and not only in relation to the topic today, but to this whole week of events. So over to you, Ella, to kick us off. Thank you. Ella, we can't hear you.
You need to open your mic.
Okay, so
Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear. The floor is yours.
We're all in the same room, but we didn't want to be like in a far camera, so we're joining from different laptops. And obviously, for any webinar to go well, we have to first have some technical problems with the mic, and then we can start the discussion. So I'm very happy to be, first of all, invited to be one of the panelists on today's webinar and share a bit of our experience and a bit of maybe opinions for the future of our sector and our new cluster. Introduced me in my previous role as a global shelter cluster coordinator, but I think maybe for this webinar, it's also important to note that together with Seki, who is the global cluster coordinator now, we were the chapter authors for the last revision of Sphere's Shelter and Settlements chapter. So we seem to have swapped roles a little bit now, but as you can see, that is very much intertwined with how the cluster looks at bringing excellence to the work that we do at global and country level. So today we will discuss whether actually the standards still have a place in our sector, because at the moment everything that we seemed unshakable, even like the 7 principles of our work, everything seems to be crumbling and seems to become irrelevant. Maybe it's a bit of a dark place at the moment. So today we're going to look at whether it still has a place, and if it does, what that place is. And if it really even makes sense to talk about universal standards. I mean, my answer to that question at the moment is a yes, and I think it's even more important to be talking about policies and standards, even if they seem irrelevant, if only because it still gives us a light and a beacon to strive towards. The fact that we might be challenged at the moment to meet a lot of the requirements of maybe Sphere puts on us, it doesn't mean that it's not relevant, and we should not be reminded of the need where it came from. So maybe we can go to the next slide, and then we can just remind ourselves. Mandy said that 20 years of cluster makes you feel like you're ancient. I'm going to take you even a bit further away, and I have to say that I personally remember it, so that makes it even maybe worse. So the Sphere is, of course, the most well-known standard in the set of standards in the humanitarian sector, and it started. At the moment, we have 4 versions of it. And it started after the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The failures of the system at that point led in 1997 a group of NGOs and the Red Cross Red Crescent movement to come together and form what used to be known as Sphere Project at the time. It was a project. Now it's of course no longer a project. It's a set of standards. And the main purpose was to uphold the rights and dignity of crisis-affected people by ensuring accountability. You need to go back, Pascal, you moved the slide. By ensuring quality, principled, and accountable aid. I think this is still very much relevant at the moment, and I think it also shows the power of having a clear vision and a standard to strive towards. It's not affected what we want to achieve, what is required of our sector at all levels to achieve has not changed in the 20 years. Well, for Sphere, it's even almost 30 years of time. The fact that the environment has become more challenging, of course, is an issue we have to deal with, but the vision is still there and very much relevant. So I said that there are 4 editions of it. I will not go into all of it. Of course, the first edition in 2000, I was trained in that when I used to work in my home country, was the initial set of standards. And in 2004, there was a revision to reflect lessons learned and following an external evaluation. 2011 was more further expansion and updates. But in 2018, the one that Seki and I had the pleasure to work on was really quite a shift for the handbook itself, but also for the shelter section. So in the handbook, there was the integration of the core humanitarian standard. Until that point, they were 2 separate guidance. And then there were a lot of new additions or cross-cutting considerations that were very much in line with the evolution of the sector. So we should think about the big disasters also that led to the creation of our cluster. All of that was actually in the end reflected in the 2018 version. So we can maybe take a closer look at the shelter section, how at the time, I mean, this is also, of course, again, 7 years ago. There's going to be a new revision at some point in very near future. So maybe we can go to the next slide, Pascal. And for those of you who remember how the 2011 version was, we used to have 10 standards, and they were divided 5 plus 5 over shelter and settlements and non-food items. So non-food items itself had 5 separate standards. So in the 2018, we can see a significant shift from looking at shelter and everything around it as a product towards sheltering as a process in a settlement context, including urban settings. So all of that thinking, which maybe feels very natural to us now, 7 years ago, that was still something that had to be put on paper. And really that shift that had been happening, of course, before already had to be put in a context. So that turned into what most of you probably know, and it turned into 7 standards. And when you look at it, it goes from the large scale, like the settlement scale, to the household items. And then we have 2 enabling standards. So that was the structure that we had in mind. And I have to say that it wasn't Seki and me who came up with the idea and just wrote this ourselves. We had really hundreds of contributors who have given us more than 7,000 inputs. So we were going through these inputs one by one. So I have to say that this was very much a consensus about what the sector was thinking. And of course, I know we're going to discuss localization in the later hours of this webinar. 1/3 of these contributors were from the local level. So I think it's also important to note that there was this process was very localized. I mean, Sphere is, of course, very localized with a lot of languages, a lot of country activities. So this was very much reflected. And then this turned into the 7 standards that we know now. And NFI became just one standard in itself, household items. And then, of course, we introduced, in line with the evolution of the sector, a new standard, the security of tenure. And environmental sustainability, it was called something different. Used to be one of the standards in the previous edition, but it was quite activity-based. We really tried to turn it into an enabling standard, and a lot of time and energy also from Mandy's side went into it to make sure that it really held our sector to a higher standard and higher accountability than there was before. I think for the scene setting, maybe this is enough because we will be having a discussion. So I'm very happy to be handing over to Kelly, who will go deeper into the environmental sustainability one. And if there are any questions, then we can also answer at the end of his intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. And yes, I remember the process well. It's good to be taken back there through your words. And just before Kelly starts, I just wanted to quickly introduce him. So we work together as environmental advisors with the Global Shelter Cluster in the support team. But importantly, I wanted to mention in the context of what he's going to talk about today, that he has been co-chairing the environment community of practice of the Global Shelter Cluster basically since it started, and pushing environmental issues to the forefront of the cluster long before it was such a core part of our work. So, Kelly, I'll pass over to your very knowledgeable hands to talk about how environment has evolved over the past 20 years. Over to you.
Thanks, Mandy, and I appreciate the introduction here. And I'm very happy to be in this session to talk about the environment because it has been something that we've been working on for quite some time. So going back to before the cluster, it's important to note that there has been an interest in environment, probably going back more than 30 years at this point. There was a lot of work on refugees and environment in Rwanda and West Africa in the 90s. Agencies such as CARE and UNHCR were doing considerable work in that area. UNHCR developed a whole set of tools and procedures on that. Funding actually came from the French and the US Department of State. And we saw also in that period the creation of the Joint Environment Unit, the Joint United Nations Environment Program, OCHA Environment Unit, which became a focal point for a lot of discussions about environment and disasters and humanitarian response, not only after an earthquake, for instance, but also if an industrial plant blows up and stuff like things like that. So there's quite a lot of an expansion even before Sphere got started. And then in the first version of Sphere, as Zella noted, there was mention of the environment. So the environment was incorporated in Sphere from the beginning. The South Asia tsunami provided a point for a concentration of these efforts, but also an expansion of these efforts. So there were assessments on environmental impacts done in Sri Lanka and in Aceh. There are actually several assessments done in Aceh. And one of the good outcomes of this was a bringing together of interests in Sri Lanka about environment. So we had CARE, CRS, a number of other agencies looking at environment. And there was the development of the Shelter Environment Checklist for Sri Lanka, which was a quick and easy to use tool to try to assess and address environmental issues. And Sphere was part of the foundation of that. The Sphere guidelines are part of the foundation for use of that checklist. So that was before the clusters got started. As the clusters were created, there was a lot of discussion about where environment should sit. And so there was a very active discussion about whether environment should be a cluster of its own. And there was a bit of tension, one might say, over who would control that cluster and how that would move forward. In the end, it was decided that environment was a cross-cutting issue. Even then, that was recognized as a potential kiss of death because cross-cutting issues are a responsibility of everybody, but nobody's responsible for them. However, in the end, and part of it was an outgrowth of the experiences in Sri Lanka, the shelter cluster became sort of the de facto home for environment and humanitarian operations long before the community of practice was created officially, but still there were people within the cluster structure, partners and in Geneva who were interested in the environment and wanted to keep it going. So when we get to 2018, as Ella mentioned, there was a revision of Sphere and a revision of the section on environment to be much more specific about a need for humanitarian organizations to assess their environmental impacts and address those, in effect aligning the approach of the humanitarian sector in Sphere with the environmental approach that would be used for a normal development project, but in ways which are much more flexible and appropriate for humanitarian assistance. So after that point, I just wanted to note some things there. I think they're in the chat now. There's been the environment, the charter for environment and climate, if I get the title right, the Humanitarian Aid Donors Declaration on Climate and Environment, the ECHO minimum standards and requirements for EU-funded humanitarian operations. The ECHO 1 form, project submission form, includes a requirement for environmental screening. There was the joint initiative, which is continuing in a sort of a different form right now, and the development of a new assessment tool, the NEAT Plus tool. And then we had organizations like ACTED, which focused on a 000 policy, which would be zero carbon footprint. And so over time, we've seen an evolution of not only the policy at a global level, the donors, but also in some of the partners that we work with, and most of the partners we work with have developed some sort of focus on environment or focus on climate and environment. I also know CRS has done this, a number of others have done these kinds of things, and you can find those on the web. Now, turning to the Global Shelter Cluster over time, a little bit about the practical. So There have been environmental advisors deployed through the cluster in Haiti in 2 different disasters, the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, the West Padang earthquake, which most people probably forget, but that was an environmental deployment. Typhoon Haiyan, and then in Turkey, there was an environmental deployed. Now, if you think about all the disasters that have happened since the creation of the cluster, that's not very many disasters, but significant ones in many cases. So the deployment of environmental advisors has been more not than often, frankly. It becomes complicated sending somebody to the field. You have to find financing, qualified people, other kinds of things like that. But that's not to say that the environment hasn't been part of these responses and many, many others. And so what's been happening is that most of the support to clusters in the field, operational clusters on environmental issues, has been remote, and through the development of guidance and policy notes and trainings and other kinds of things that have happened. So it's a bit of, personally, I would say not an equal balance, but it's not been that just the deployment of advisors is important. It's also this remote support that we continue to provide in a very active manner. So for the first maybe 15 years of the cluster, the approach to environmental issues was more or less the squeaky wheel. I would stand up in front of a cluster meeting in Geneva and say how many people know about the environment and requirements. People would raise their hand. I say how many people implement those. Nobody would raise their hand. I would then get a little hot under the collar, and it would be commented later that I was not being totally positive in my comments. But at the same time, it kept environment there. People kept acknowledging it. And then occasionally I would be approached on different kinds of things about, we need to look at the environment in Iraq. We need to look at environment. How do you dispose of tents? Those kinds of things. So questions that are important, but it was more of an ad hoc kind of thing. So this overlapped a little bit. The latter part overlapped a little bit with the official creating of a community of practice, an environment community of practice, as sort of a restructuring of part of the cluster. And that then provided an opportunity for us to not only shift some responsibility from me just being the squeaky wheel to getting other people involved in that process, but also expanding the scope of what's been done. So we see in the last 5 years, both a greater focus on funding and policy, and a lot of more engagement through the community of practice and through other parts of the cluster, engagement from the field, lots of guidance and documents. And if you go to the Environment Community of Practice webpage, you'll see a lot of those. There's over 140, I think, at this point. We see partners giving a lot more attention to the environment, although oftentimes they talk about climate is a top topic, but I point out all the time that climate is part of the environment, so climate policies are environment policies. And there is much greater donor interest in this. And as I mentioned before, there are these policy documents that have been issued by a number of donors or groups of donors on this. And so we're seeing that continue even in the face of the current challenge about funding. And so the interest in the environment, the greening, humanitarian assistance is something that continues. There's an interest in that, but funding it, of course, is going to be a challenge. So one of the challenges looking back on the last 20 years is that we've moved forward from a question about why humanitarian assistance is doing environment, or as somebody said to me, we'll plant trees later, to a recognition that it is core to the humanitarian response. It's been incorporated within the policies of the Global Shelter Cluster. It's been discussed in meetings. It's been funded, which is most important in many ways. It continues to be funded. So there is that action there is that engagement, there is that progress that's been made. And I want to point out that the environment community practice has played a sometimes behind the scenes role in this by being active in cluster meetings and helping put suggestions forward for policy and helping to write policies and everything like that. So the environment community practice hasn't implemented any big projects per se as individuals, but it's been very active in the sort of the groundwork, if one could call it that, of getting environment to become part of the overall cluster strategy. Now, with this progress, I do have to note that we're not getting a lot of evidence that this is making a difference on the ground, And even though ECHO has reporting requirements and Sphere has standards and things like that, we don't necessarily see evidence of that from the reporting that comes from the ground. So project analysis, project reviews, project reports, evaluations and things like that. So I think there's a challenge that we come up with that is the question of whether all this policy and progress and support that's developed significantly over the years is actually resulting in changes on the ground. And if it's not, then we have to think about how to turn the policy into practice. There may be a need to return a bit to the squeaky wheel and ask why evaluations aren't looking at environmental issues and where are the environmental assessments that should be done for each project, according to Sphere, according to the donors, according to good practice, they're supposed to be done, but we're not seeing that evidence. So that's a challenge that we're coming out with. Looking forward, I think we have in place a lot of the policy. It's not really more developing policy, but turning that into practical action and a practical way of doing things. And we're doing some of that through the work that we've been doing with countries on the environment country profiles or country environmental profiles, and following through on that and trying to help countries better engage, programs and partners better engage on environmental issues, because they also have an impact on their operations and how well they can support effective populations. Now, in closing, I'd like to also do a shout out to Anita Van Breda from WWF, who over this same period of the last certainly 5 years, well, all the way back to the tsunami in South Asia, has been working in sort of a parallel but very collaborative way, working on environmental issues, providing tools, developing capacities and things like that. And so what the shelter cluster has been doing and what she has been doing has been very closely tied together in an operational and pragmatic sense. I'd also like to shout out to the ECOP members. Sorry, it's early in the morning here. Because we've moved from people saying, why should we worry about the environment, to a point where it is currently in the global shelter cluster strategy, and the projections are that it will be part of a new strategy, the new strategy for the new cluster. I also do want to recognize also that this same period has seen some other changes, one of which is the logistics cluster has, in a very nicely competitive way, I think, taken on a lot of environmental issues about supply chain management and other aspects like that. And so it's not been just the shelter cluster alone now that's moving forward on this, but also with the logistics cluster, and also because of the concerns about climate change, other clusters who have been focusing on climate change, such as the WASH cluster. So I'd like to just close there, recognize that we've made considerable progress and based on the standards and develop the standards, and from Sphere, continuing to rely on those. But we also probably look forward to more asking the question about how is this being applied on the ground, and seeing how we can actually support partners to do that in the current operating conditions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for your reflections, and yeah, to both of you for bringing a lot of really interesting topics up here, and please do contribute those ideas as well when we come to the questions in the Menti, because they're all very interconnected. Maybe just take a couple of questions now before we move on to the other speakers. Ella, there's a question for you in the chat. Is it possible for the cluster to support the contextualization of the Sphere standards to suit certain contexts? And I guess maybe in conjunction with that question, it might be interesting just to reflect a little bit on the contextualization of universal or global standards in general, and the importance or unimportance of that, whatever is your opinion. Thank you.
Now?
Okay.
Can you hear?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yes, I think that's a very good question. And maybe it's also a way to debunk one of the big misunderstandings around Sphere. And that is actually the difference between the standards in the Sphere and the key actions. So when you look at the standards in Sphere, and that's not just for shelter, all of them, when you look at the way that the standard is formulated, that is universal. It's the key action that requires the localization and the contextualization part. I just, while Kelly was talking, I just ran to my desk to get the book. because after 7 years, I don't always remember it word by word. And if we just take, for example, the second standard, location and settlement planning, the standard says shelters and settlements are located in safe and secure areas, offering adequate space and access to essential services and livelihoods. I think this is applicable everywhere across the board. How we do it, through which key actions, that's where we need to look at the context, the constraints, of course, and that's, I think, where the clusters, and of course, I'm not going to make promises in terms of resources on behalf of the country clusters, but as a role, where we have the capacity, collectively, of course, we can look at how that standard in that context can be achieved, which would be the key factors, which would be the technical assistance that's required, or how it will be delivered through markets or whatever. And of course, which environmental considerations should be there for that context. I think the cluster can really play a key role there to make that translation of the standard into the local reality. I see a great and unique role for the cluster teams there, even more so now that the new cluster will have a broader scope, so our actions will have even more impact on the lives of the affected people. So I think that would be a yes from my end, but I'm also very interested in the conversation and the discussion if people think differently at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. And I see there was somebody else in the chat that said they wanted to ask a question, but did not raise exactly what the question was. So if there is anyone else that has a question, could you please put your hand up or just jump in? No?
Maybe, can you hear me?
Yes.
A quick piece of instruction for all participants. If they want to speak, you need to go in the React and raise your hand. And this is how we will open your mic. We cannot open your mic without you raising your hands. Thank you. Over.
Thanks, Caroline. Maybe in the interest of time, we will move on to our next presenters. And then if anyone has any additional questions for Kelly and Ella, please do pop them in the chat. So I'll pass over to Pascal now to facilitate this part of the session. Just to echo Kelly's words about the importance for moving from paper to action and policy to practice, I think taking us down to the country level will take us along that journey on our topic for today. So over to you, Pascal, to introduce our next speakers.
I would like to introduce Patrick Moutaille. It's a very experienced shelter person. He has been a shelter cluster coordinator now in Syria, but also in the past, he was also in Gaziantep response for the earthquake in Turkey. And he was also working in Afghanistan. So I'm passing over to you. So it's very interesting to have inputs from people from the field. So over to you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. You'll put it on full screen, yeah?
Yeah, I'm trying. I know.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll start as you work on that. So today I'll walk you through the evolution of the dignified shelter approach in Northwest Syria and how the guidance matured over 3 years, and most importantly, the measurable impact it delivered to nearly 200,000 people in displacement. So this initiative began in Northwest Syria during the cross-border times before we merged into one Syria coordination structure, but its principles now inform our wider nationwide housing repair and return support that we are currently working on here in Syria. So let me take you through this, how this transition happened. Next slide. Yes, so today we'll cover just 5 key areas. One is why dignified shelter was needed. how the guidance evolved, what impact the projects achieved, why technical guidance made the difference, and finally, what this means going forward. This structure mirrors the evolution of the response, the needs, the solution, the evidence, and of course, the dignified shelter legacy. Next slide. So, why dignified shelter? For years, tents were the default shelter solution in Northwest Syria. But as displacement stretched into its second decades, tents became deeply inadequate. The key issues that came up was exposure to harsh winter storms, flooding. We also had overcrowding and lack of privacy, increasing GBV and protection risks. Tents also came with poor thermal performance and minimal weather resistance. And then we had high recurring costs. So tents were replaced every 6 to 12 months. And we also had to do repeated winterization. This also led to limited accessibility for persons with disability. And then we also had the 2023 earthquake that exposed extreme vulnerability of temporary tent settlements. So it became clearer that the operation required a durable, protective, and cost-effective alternative, one that improved safety, dignity, environment resilience, and cost efficiency. Next slide. You can move to the next 2 slides, Pascal. So I would like to just show you how the guidelines evolved over the 3-year period, because we did start this approach in 2022 all through to 2024. So the guidance, the dignified shelter approach did not, appear overnight. It developed through a deliberate, iterative, evidence-based process over these 3 years. In 2022, we first initiated, setting the foundation, the vision, the early standards and strategy through the development of 4 key documents. The first one being the conceptual framework, which was titled Dignified Shelter and Living Conditions. This was a high-level conceptual and strategic document that introduced what the dignified shelter approach is and why it is needed. Then the second document that was developed at the time also was the Dignified and Safer Living Conditions Guidance. This was jointly prepared with the involvement of other clusters like WASH, CCCM, early recovery, and protection clusters. And it was basically a technical and operational guidance document that explained how to implement the dignified shelter and safer living conditions approach at site level, with, of course, infusing multi-sector integration. The third guidance we did develop was an action plan. The action plan defined the targets, the phasing, issues on housing, land and property due diligence, and site selection criteria. We also set an initial target of 45,000 households in the first phase. And we also did have a 4th document, which was a technical guidance, the first standardized shelter designs, layouts, and BOQs. So this was in 2022. In 2023, we embarked on consolidation through learning and partner feedback. And we did this through an after-action review workshop where we looked at key lessons learned. This was through the last 1 year of implementation that partners had experienced. So some of the key recommendations that came up were like having clearer targeting, clearer site planning criteria, integrating WASH and shelter designs, improving materials, and stronger multi-cluster coordination. So in 2023 was basically the year we listened, adapted, and strengthened the model. From this, we formed a technical working group to refine the standards and also look into the recommendations that came out of these key lessons learned. In 2024, we accomplished enhanced standardization, evidence, and finalization of the complete toolkit. So the technical working group came up with a an updated technical guidance. We also updated the action plan by increasing the target from 45,000 to 81,500 households. And then we introduced an additional guidance on a dignified shelter options catalog, complete with 3D animation for those non-technical people. And we did conduct an impact assessment. So we surveyed 380 households that had received dignified shelters, and they validated the approach with strong evidence. Additionally, we conducted a validation workshop with IDPs to review the design and collected their feedback. So by 2024, we had a complete partner-ready standardized toolkit, strong enough to ensure a quality response. Next slide. So if you look at these are the documents that I've just talked about. In 2022, we had 4 documents in total, and we updated in 2024 the last 2 documents on the right. We updated the action plan and the technical guidance and developed a new additional document that provided detailed specifications and drawings. So all these documents are available in the Northwest Syria page under the new One Syria page on the Shelter Cluster website, and has been maintained for future learnings. Next slide. So what impact did the projects achieve? So the evidence speaks for itself. So evidence from households surveyed, they reported that, so 99% of households reported protection from harsh weather. 53% felt very safe, 34% safe. 80% of the persons with disability households face no major barriers. And interestingly, 67% reported improved livelihoods. This was based on the assessment that I mentioned that we did in 2024. So when you look at the 5 to 10-year lifespan of the dignified shelter versus the 6 to 12-month lifespan of tents, we see a high level of cost efficiency. For example, the dignified shelter would cost anything between $2,000 to $3,000 US, while the tent would cost up to around $800 and would last only 6 to 12 months. So if you do 2 to 3 rounds of distribution of tents, you're already close to the cost of a dignified shelter. So additionally, of course, the dignified shelter reduced repeated procurement and seasonal winterization needs. Overall, the approach has delivered safer and more dignified, more accessible and more cost-effective living conditions. When you look at the delivery at scale, we delivered over 15,600 shelters in 2022, 19,500 dignified shelters in 2023, and then we saw a dip in 2024 to where we delivered only 7,600 due to funding cuts. So over the 3 years, 34 organizations delivered more than 42,000 dignified shelters, providing safer living conditions to close to 200,000 individuals. And I must say, this was one of the largest multi-year transitional shelter investments ever implemented in Syria. Next slide. So why technical guidance made a difference? So the biggest enabler of impact was not funding or materials. I believe it was strong, harmonized technical guidance. And I would like to highlight 6 advantages of course, we might have more than these 6, but I would like to highlight these 6 advantages. One is standardization and quality assurance. Here, they prevented substandard construction and ensured safety. The second is it contributed to faster, predictable responses. So the ready-made designs saved weeks of engineering time by our partners. The third is better targeting and harmonization. Everyone used the same selection criteria, the same designs, and also reduced the duplication. The fourth is stronger donor confidence. The clear standards led to predictable quality, hence sustained support. The fifth is continuity despite staffing changes. So Northwest Syria had at least 3 different coordinators during this period, myself included, and I'm sure a few that are in this session. and of course, multiple information management officers, technical working groups. Yet the quality improved each year because the guidance preserved institutional memory. And lastly is the evidence-based decision-making, where the after-action reviews, the lessons learned, the post-distribution monitoring reports, the household surveys, the engineering reviews all fed into the update. So this is why the model survived, improved, and scaled through this 3-year period. Next slide. Just to conclude, I would say that there was a transformation in Northwest Syria camps, where we had, or we saw, camps and the transition from tents to safer, more resilient, dignified shelters, as you can see in the photo in this slide, the before and after photo. And actually on your right, that photo is not AI generated, it's a real aerial photo of the same camp, Al-Salam Ajele camp in Janderas, Afrin, that was supported by the country-based pool fund, benefiting over 200 families. When you look at the guidance, strong, harmonized standard guidance ensured consistency and safety. The evidence itself showed, so the data showed clear gains in protection, well-being, accessibility, and cost efficiency. On continuity, the guidance preserved quality through leadership and staffing changes. And lastly, where we are right now, these principles now guide the nationwide housing repair and return support under one Syria framework. So thank you all. As you've seen today, the standards, strong guidance and clear technical, strong policy and clear technical guidance don't just shape shelters, they shape futures. By building on what we've learned in Northwest Syria, we can contribute to advancing policies that ensure safe, dignified shelters for families today and more resilient solutions for tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. A very interesting presentation, and we can see really how standard can change also the response and the quality, and to have more dignified shelter for the affected population. That's an example in Syria, and we have other also example in other countries. Congrats for the job, and thank you for this presentation. And now we will switch to the French-speaking countries in Burkina Faso. I will switch also to French. So I just remind, please select on the icon, on the globe icon, your language. You will need to select the English, because from Burkina Faso we speak in French. Thank you very much. Let me pass the slide. Okay, Ephraim, à toi. So just a short introduction, first in English. So Ephraim Ibo is working for CRS, Catholic Relief Service. He's the co-coordinator in Burkina Faso. We are very also happy to see like how NGO can be the co-lead of the cluster, and the next steps in this new cluster will be also to have more localized and more involvement from a national level. So that's great. So Ephraim is the coordinator in Burkina Faso, and he will share an experience is ongoing in Burkina Faso. Ephraim, donc tu as compris, je t'ai fait une petite introduction, donc je te laisse à toi, ok? Et tu peux aller en français, hein?
Super. Merci Pascal. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Donc, je me nomme Ephraim Ilboudo. Donc, j'occupe le poste de programme manager de l'initiative Logement et Communauté, ou Homes and Communities, au sein de Catholic Relief Service au Burkina Faso. Donc, c'est un réel plaisir d'intervenir aujourd'hui pour partager avec vous le travail en cours sur les lignes directrices pour l'adaptation des interventions abri au contexte du Burkina Faso, élaboré en 2024 en collaboration avec le cluster abri du Burkina Faso et l'ensemble des parties prenantes de la réponse sectorielle abri. Slide. Donc, cette dynamique est née face à un constat alarmant. Donc, comme vous pouvez le voir, en 2023, l'analyse de la réponse rapide en faveur des personnes déplacées internes révélait un taux de couverture de seulement 5% pour les abris et 17% pour les articles ménagers essentiels. Donc, face à ces insuffisances et en concertation avec la coordination du cluster abri, nous avons décidé de mettre en place un groupe de travail technique que nous appelons le GTT, adossé au guide Choix éclairé pour un meilleur logement. Donc, ce GTT rassemble l'ensemble des acteurs clés de la réponse abri, notamment les services techniques de l'État à travers ces structures déconcentrées comme l'urbanisme, les infrastructures et l'action humanitaire. Nous avons également les ONG nationales et internationales. Nous avons les organisations de la société civile, notamment l'Ordre des architectes du Burkina Faso. Nous avons les universités techniques aussi qui nous accompagnent dans cette initiative. Donc, pour ce faire, nous avons établi une feuille de route articulée au cours de 5 cadres d'échange. Donc, la première a consisté à un état des lieux sur les pratiques existantes, des actions antérieures et les principales problématiques identifiées. Donc, autour d'une table avec l'ensemble des acteurs, nous avons parcouru les problématiques phares qui entravent la réponse sectorielle en abri. Et au cours de cette journée, nous avons pu lister au total 8 problématiques, dont la conception et la typologie des abris, le logement en terre et biens, l'accès à la terre pour les personnes déplacées, la coordination entre les acteurs de la réponse, nous avons la cohésion sociale, la participation communautaire, les ressources humaines, les ressources financières et l'accessibilité. Donc, au total, nous avons eu 8 problématiques sur lesquelles le groupe de travail s'est penché pour identifier ensuite les acteurs clés qui sont à même de résoudre ces problématiques. Donc, ensuite, nous avons établi des résultats attendus et ensuite un canevas pour pouvoir mettre en place, pour pouvoir résoudre ces problématiques que nous avons identifiées. Donc, au cours de notre deuxième session avec le groupe de travail, nous avons essayé de prioriser les problématiques qui peuvent avoir un impact plus significatif sur l'amélioration de la réponse abri. Et parmi ces, sur un total de 8 problématiques, le groupe de travail a décidé de retenir que 3 et de mettre en place des lignes directrices pour pouvoir améliorer la réponse. Donc, sur les 3 problématiques retenues de façon unanime, nous avons retenu la participation communautaire. Et ici, le groupe de travail a identifié, a voulu vraiment assurer que les modèles de logement proposés par les acteurs humanitaires soient réellement alignés sur les besoins, les capacités et les préférences des communautés affectées. Deuxièmement, sur le logement terre et biens, le groupe de travail a décidé d'appliquer des stratégies de sécurisation foncière adaptées au contexte local afin de garantir une protection des droits des populations en situation de crise. Donc, la dernière problématique qui concerne la conception et la typologie des abris. Donc, pour promouvoir des solutions d'abri selon les approches pleinement ancrées dans les cultures constructives locales. Donc ici, nous voulons vraiment que les abris que nous proposons aux personnes affectées reflètent vraiment leur culture, leur savoir-faire et aussi les matériaux qui sont localement disponibles si possible. Donc, avant de nous engager sur ces 3 problématiques, nous avons jugé indispensable de conduire une revue documentaire. Donc, slide, Pascal, s'il te plaît.
Ouais.
Slide. Donc, à ce niveau, nous avons décidé de conduire une recherche documentaire qui a été facilitée. OK, qui a été facilitée par Cratère. Et ensuite, nous... Je ne sais pas si... Pascal, ça va toujours?
Oui, oui.
Un écho. OK, super, merci.
Non, tout
Donc,
va bien.
je disais tantôt que... OK. Avant d'engager les travaux approfondis sur les 3 domaines, le GTT a jugé indispensable de conduire une revue documentaire exhaustive afin de recenser les lignes directrices existantes au niveau national, régional et international. Et nous avons pu recenser autour de 100 documents qui ont été analysés. Ensuite, ce travail de recherche a été soumis au groupe de travail pour des amendements beaucoup plus dans le cadre juridique, parce que au niveau du logement terre et biens, nous nous sommes aperçus qu'il y avait pas mal de droits, de règles, de lois qui sont disponibles au niveau du Burkina, mais qui ne sont pas contextualisées dans notre approche. Donc, suite à la revue documentaire et aux amendements, nous avons encore décidé d'aller à l'encontre des communautés. Donc, slide. Donc, ici, comme vous pouvez le voir, nous avons encore organisé des sessions avec les communautés, les participants au programme, pour voir quelles sont les problématiques, quels sont les amendements vis-à-vis de nos 3 secteurs. Et ici, nous avons eu vraiment cette chance de discuter vraiment à bâton rompu avec les communautés qui ont apporté des amendements, qui ont apporté vraiment des pistes de solutions pour nous permettre vraiment d'avoir des lignes directrices qui sont très contextualisées au contexte du Burkina Faso. Ensuite, avec les acteurs, nous avons organisé une deuxième session afin d'amender les indicateurs des standards sphères. À ce niveau, parce que au niveau des indicateurs, nous avons remarqué que la plupart des indicateurs reflètent d'autres réalités qui ne sont pas forcément des réalités du Burkina Faso. Donc, avec l'ensemble des acteurs du gouvernement, des acteurs humanitaires, des organisations de la société civile, nous avons encore revu ces indicateurs que vous pouvez retrouver dans le site du Global Cluster où le rapport a été posté. Donc, pour aller vite, nous pouvons dire que c'est l'ensemble de ces démarches qui ont permis aujourd'hui au GTT de mettre en place des lignes directrices qui sont aujourd'hui entre griffes, je pourrais le dire, provisoires, mais c'est des lignes directrices aujourd'hui qui doivent être testées sur le terrain afin d'être réadaptées ensuite aux réalités terrain, parce que nous avons un contexte changeant, voilà. Donc aujourd'hui, nous sommes en train de l'expérimenter à travers des projets pilotes, dont probablement la sortie, comment dire, finalisée sera attendue dans les prochains jours. Donc, nous tenons également à exprimer vraiment notre gratitude au Global Shelter, qui, à travers un financement qui a été accordé à Crater, a permis de travailler sur ces lignes directrices que vous pouvez retrouver sur le site en bas. Et nous vous remercions encore très sincèrement pour cette opportunité qui a été donnée au Burkina Faso de pouvoir présenter ces lignes directrices. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Ephraim. Nous allons passer aux questions. Nous avons encore peu de temps. Alors, j'aimerais juste voir. I will switch to English. Huh? Sorry, I was skipping the French. Thank you very much, Ephraim, for this presentation. We just pass now over to Q&A. I saw one question from Joseph Ashmore to Patrick. Joseph, would you like to take to ask the question directly? I will pass over to you the authorization. Over to you, Joseph.
He says
it's written it, yeah. I've actually seen it and I can answer it. It's okay, Pascal, yeah?
Okay, you see it, huh? The question.
Yes,
okay.
I've seen it. So the question was, one of the reasons that tents continue to be delivered was the UN had a policy of only temporary shelter in the Northwest to avoid formalizing forced displacement. Was the ability for people to return also key in moving away from tents in the response? That's the first part, and I can answer it. I can say no. It was actually the opposite. It was protracted situation of the conflict, and looking at the amount of funding that had gone into the response, close to a decade, there was need for us to, change our way of doing things. But it took a lot of work, a lot of advocacy. There was a lot of resistance at the beginning because of the reasons that you've just mentioned. But we eventually managed to get the buy-in of the stakeholders. And this was mainly through the development of the conceptual framework that indicated the advantages, the pros and cons of the approach. So that ended up changing and we managed to proceed. But of course, right now, with the political changes in Syria that happened 1 year ago, we adapted and pivoted our strategy from dignified shelter to support those families that are able to return with minor and moderate shelter repair at their places of origin. On your second question, or do politics continue to dominate the technical guidance, and how can we better promote technically informed decision making? During our time in the dignified shelter approach formulation, we didn't have this, politics. And I think one of the best ways to avoid this is the formation of technical working groups that comprise of diverse expertise from different organizations. And I think this helped a lot in getting consensus. The twigs were developed with clear terms of reference, and they were given ample time to meet, several meetings to discuss, review, debate, and come up with an updated guidance. I'll give you an example. The twig that we developed in 2026, after the after action review workshop, worked for 6 months reviewing the guidance. And eventually the outcomes were quite detailed and satisfactory to all the stakeholders. So we didn't see any issues coming up on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I can also add that has changed in Syria, like during the earthquake in Turkish and in Syria. I was also in Syria side, and there was the no tents policy, which is not the best solution, but just after an emergency, after an earthquake, so it was difficult also to provide, because it can be an emergency solution. It's not the best. It's not unified shelter when you will do a resettlement. But it was also complicated. So tents is also a good way also to support in the first day, let's say, as temporary shelter, especially for people who just stay next to their damaged house, for instance. So thank you very much, Patrick. We'll pass. Oh, sorry. Okay. Now I will pass over to Mandy. So we will do a Mentimeter to have a participation. So if you can scan the QR or just copy the code, and then I will share my screen. So I'm just waiting few seconds that you have time to judge the Menti, and then I will share.
I've also put it, Pascal, into the chat as well with the code. So,
okay, great.
Great. So thank you so much, everyone who presented and asked really pertinent questions to this topic. So we're going to jump over to a Menti discussion now so that we can get your input on some of these bigger questions. So we'll just wait for a minute for the Menti to come up on the screen. Yeah. You can either join from your phone or on your computer. There are a couple of questions that require a bit of typing, so if you have a preference.
Okay, I have the Menti. Let me share. I want the Menti.
Pas en train de projeter.
Okay.
Je suis pas en train de projeter. Il faut que tu ailles sur le deuxième écran.
Il faut que tu
On voit que les instructions.
What I might do whilst they're getting the Menti up on...
Non?
Parce que tu projettes rien là. Tu projettes rien sur Zoom.
It's okay to then
present
in Teams.
No, Teams. Yeah. No. Zoom.
No, enlève ça.
But just unplug it. Just unplug it and then do it from your computer. We don't do it there.
Voilà. Maintenant, tu vas sur Zoom. Je partage ton écran.
It's the wrong thing. You unplug the wrong thing.
What I might do while they're getting it up on the screen is just give you a preview of the first question.
Okay.
So
I think
the first question is, how relevant are universal humanitarian standards in today's context of localization and reduced international assistance? So you have a scale here from 1, not relevant, to 5, extremely relevant. And actually, I might ask for if someone who either answers, well, 1, we don't have any of those on the screen yet. So 5, it seems to be the winner. Is there anyone who has answered 5 who could just raise their hand and jump in and tell us why you've given it this rating at the top of the scale? Just a reminder that you need to click on React and raise hand so that we can unmute you. And obviously our presenters are already able to unmute themselves and speak. So if someone could jump in and tell us why they've given this a 5 of extremely relevant, we'd love to hear from you. I think Lilia has her hand raised.
yeah, where Lilia? Lilia, over to you. Wait, Lilia. Okay, Lilia, you can talk now, normally.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking that it's the minimum standards for me mean that's a minimum quality that we should be ensuring in the work that we do. So, I think we all believe that our work has a high quality. If we don't make sure that we are complying with minimum standards, then how else can we really make sure that the work that we do is what it's expected? Over.
Thanks, Lydia. I fully agree, and that seems to be the consensus in the group as well. Okay, let's move on to the next question, please. So, what does the push towards localization mean for universal standards? And here it's a word cloud, so you get to write in. We've got contextualization big in the middle, which seems to be a theme today. How do we think then that standards need to adapt, and if so, how? Adaptation, contextualization, adaptive. So those seem to be the key theme here. The importance of contextualization and adaptation to different contexts. There's also some stuff in here around specific things that need to happen around training. I'm getting dizzy looking at all the words come in as they move around the screen. But yes, definitely clear trends here around the point of contextualization and adaptation. Let's move to the next question.
Wait, there was a Terry Smith who would like to say something. Over to you,
Sure.
Terry.
Oh,
Yeah, just
apologies.
one thing I wanted to highlight here, because my title has localization in it, so I feel like I have a little bit of a responsibility. I feel like we also don't listen enough to local actors when we're talking about like shelter responses and shelter standards. Speaking from Ukraine now, the approaches taken by local actors initially often were more creative and better, in my opinion, than some of the options taken by international actors in the early stages of the Ukraine response. So I do think that we also need to consider localization not just in terms of local materials and local standards for construction, but also in terms of local voices and opinions about what housing plans should look like. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Terry, for jumping in there. And couldn't agree more. Let's pass to the next slide. I see some people already answering this, which is good. So we'll be able to go through this quickly. So do standards need to evolve to remain relevant for local actors? Yes. Let's pass to the next slide, which is going to ask, if yes, why, or what ways does this need to happen? Because we seem to be pretty unanimous on that, and that's already come up quite a bit in our discussion today. Right. Could I ask someone who has contributed something on here just to jump in and tell us a little bit about their thoughts? If someone could check if there's a raised hand. Anyone like to jump in and give us some thoughts on this? Lots of really good ideas here. I think we have some raised hands.
Kelly, person I can see. I can see that. Okay, you can just give
Hey, can I? It's Jamie Richardson.
Jamie, jump in, Jamie. Right. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just thought of one of the considerations for local actors and local communities is having the transparency around the resources that can be made available to them so that they can make the informed choices that they want to make in terms of the priorities that they, that they see in terms of their situation and context. I think that sometimes is a big missing piece. And it means that there may be compromises over some of the standards that we may perceive, but in terms of their overall perception of their priorities, especially where we see other sectors, if they know what the resources they have, they can think about how best to use them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Yes, fully agree. And actually, that is probably quite a good segue to the next question, if we could pass along. And apologies, we're moving a little bit quickly through these, but we want to make sure to get to all the key topics before we finish today. So in a world of reduced funding and technical capacity, what is our role as clusters? What role should we play? So this is kind of the question of the relevance of clusters in the current landscape and how things are changing. So this is could be relevant to standards and policies, but definitely don't limit answers to that. You can look a little bit more broadly as well. So we've got some good ideas coming in here around our role as coordination, same as always. Let's keep doing what we're doing. Excellent. Facilitators, listeners, conveyors, promoting standards and information management. Yes. And let's just pass to the next one, please, because this question follows on. So should clusters focus more on enabling local actors or on maintaining global coherence? Interested to see what comes in here. You've got the option of both or neither. Glad to see no one thinks neither. There seems to be, yes, a preference for both, as well as enabling local actors. So I think there's a question here on why are these in opposition to each other? I think it's more just to be a bit provocative and get the ideas to come forward, as opposed to saying that they are not, that they're in opposition to each other. Yes, I mean, I would say it's really not an either or, right? Clusters can support local leadership while upholding universal standards. And in fact, local leadership will thrive more when there's clear common frameworks to lean on. And so hopefully we can continue to hold this kind of shared compass going forward while helping local actors to steer the ship. Right. I think, could we just quickly jump to actually number 8, if you wouldn't mind, just to make sure we have a little bit of time to looking ahead, which is obviously an important part of why we're here today. So what lessons can we draw from these examples for future policy or standard development? And maybe while we just wait for everyone to put their thoughts in there, I think Kelly, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I did. And actually, it's reflecting on all these questions. So 2 points I think are important to recognize. One of which is over the last 20 years, sphere has been nationalized in a number of cases. I believe India has adopted sphere-based standards. A number of countries have adopted sphere as part of their overall humanitarian response. And so that means when a disaster occurs, you don't have to go in and have large meetings to explain all the policies and procedures that are incorporated in sphere and the other kinds of things. So that's an important step. But taking that to the next level, which is preparedness, and thinking about what would be needed for shelter in a country that might be affected by a hurricane, and doing some preparedness for that so that the national authorities and other national actors understand what would happen if there was external assistance coming in with all of its standards and procedures and other stuff, I think is quite important. And the Global Shelter Cluster has done a little bit of that with support from UNDRR in Yemen, Mali, Madagascar, and someplace else, I can't remember. But so this thinking a little bit more about preparedness and not just arriving in a country and dumping all the standards on people. I also want to shout out to IOM, which has been working with communities outside of a country and helping them understand how to do that, particularly in Haiti. So I think there's a lot more we should think about in the future about being prepared for disasters and explaining how we operate and how we do things, rather than just showing up and saying, by the way, everything has to be done our way, which is not the way things should happen, but sometimes that ends up what it sounds like. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for those thoughts. And actually, I wonder, as we draw to a close of this webinar, whether I might also ask, and those Kelly kind of served as some final thoughts there of what's come out of today and what we've discussed. But I wonder if I could ask whether any of the other presenters at the beginning had any kind of key takeaways from all this discussion. I guess one of mine, which feels quite clear from today, that localization doesn't make standards less relevant. It may actually make them more important in terms of our role as clusters for enabling local capacity and making sure that the role of clear shared guidance is really at the forefront. I wonder, Ella, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
When you say final, okay,
or key takeaways. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Now without an echo. No, I think when you say final, that sounds a little bit too absolute. I think it's more a matter of how we are going to, looking from the coordination point of view and our cluster, like how we're going to maintain the standards and the policies as the scope of the cluster becomes larger, and how we're going to make that relevant for the local actors. I mean, clearly the cluster will have a dual role, and sometimes even if, as Terry was saying, they don't stand in opposition, but it's sometimes quite difficult to deliver on both fronts when you have a small team, and the daily realities are going to take over, and maybe one or the other will go to the back of our minds. I think as the cluster also becomes larger in scope, we need to really focus on the standard itself of making sure that people have access to what they need as part of their human rights. And we need to really focus on how, through policies, as Patrick was mentioning, localized policies, we can enable the local actors to deliver on it. So it's not, it's really focusing on that enabling role, unpacking some of the maybe more complex realities or the big English words into something where everyone can feel like they have a role to play. I think that will be more and more important as we go to a new 20 years, a new cluster, a new scope. But I think the need for the standards as the distilled wisdom of many years of experience, many years of expertise will still be there. So I'd like to finish on that positive note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ella. And in fact, you said almost exactly what I was going to say to wrap up. So I'm not going to repeat myself. Thank you so much for those wise words. Yeah, so maybe just to finish up, just to thank everybody so much who came along today, our speakers, everyone who shared examples and experiences and gave us food for thought in the Menti that we will obviously take away and reflect on as we transition into the new cluster. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation today and helping us shape what comes next and reflect on what has gone by. Please, can I encourage you to join us tomorrow? We have the next edition of our 20th year celebrations on building shelter coordination and response capacity, stories, systems, and the next generation. So we have some really interesting speakers lined up to reflect on this. And we look forward to seeing you then to continue the week of these celebrations. Thank you so much.